it to a vote, and because they're influenced by, they're all bought by special interest money. Not to overstate it, but whereas our Colorado folks, I'm very proud of what we did in Colorado to resist, knowing very well that what could happen and what did happen, people losing their jobs over these issues. So I think, there are things in Colorado where I think we do a good job and lead a little bit. We also had about 70% vote in favor of the amendment 65. A couple of years ago. Yeah, which was, what was the title of that?
I can't tell you. It was Amendment 65. I can't tell you what the exact title was.
But essentially,
campaign finance.
Campaign finance and support of the move to amend, a support of overturning Citizens United. And so, that's a great indicator when you've got 70% of Colorado taking that stance, that the will of the people is there, and it's just, we need to act on that will. I think. I should probably take another question, but I will try to. I think.
I hope it sounds better than what I heard down in Arapahoe County.
Yeah, but the part of it is this politics as usual, and I think you can know. I hope you would know, those who know me, that you're probably not going to get politics as usual with me. I think. One of the things I did before being the captain of the district for the Democratic Party was I was a county officer for Denver, for the Democratic Party. And I was very much an outsider when I came in. I was very much against the odds that I would have been elected. And I was very much the odd man out on that officer corps. And I often had to confront them and challenge them, and sometimes publicly, when they wouldn't listen privately, about ethical issues that they were, coming close to breaking the law, and certainly breaking some ethical boundaries, and got them to change and got people to do the right thing. But I was a thorn in people's side for when I first came in, and I think when I went out, I'd made a really big impact. Hard to talk positively about yourself for so long, but I think I can be proud of having raised the level of our county party and the way we operated and the way we communicated, and getting us on a little bit better ethical track. So I think there is a track record that people can see in a lot of different areas where, in this knocking every door, and I'll shut up on this, but that's something that I was Irene's campaign manager, Irene Aguilar, and she didn't need to knock any door to get reelected. Nobody in Denver, elected Denver Democrat, needs to. But we spent 2 years, winter, spring, summer, fall, knocking doors and getting out to constituents, because being a good legislator made her a good candidate. And she didn't need to be a good candidate, but she needed to be a good legislator. And that's what I did as a campaign manager, put my money where my mouth is, that we want to get to people, we want to represent people, we want to hear all those voices, we want to bring those voices to the Capitol, and that's what I would do, after being elected too. It's easy to think things change after election, but I think I have a little bit of a track record to show that they don't. What's another question? Yeah.
So, you mentioned that you worked hard on the school funding, and I have to say, I was a college student here and a ski bum, and then I left, and I was living in Tennessee, and then I moved back here, and I've been appalled by the level of funding for education here. When I first moved here, my children decided to repeat kindergarten, and I had to pay, and people said, oh, well, it's full-day kindergarten. I said, I lived in Tennessee, where I had not a hotbed of intellectualism, and I had full-day kindergarten for free.
Yeah.
Under, actually, I think at the time, a Republican that put it in. And the Republican actually put pre-K, before, into it for full funding for all Tennessee children. Yeah. And I come here, and there are all these people are well educated. Why are we not getting the money? And because this failed, what are your solutions for how other bills can be introduced that won't fail at a state level, not just, this neighborhood's fine.
Yeah.
These kids are getting educated,
Yeah.
but they're not in the north of Denver,
Right.
and they're not in lots of places in the valley and other places.
Yeah.
Because people pony up for kindergarten, which they shouldn't have to.
Yeah. Well, and that was part of 66, and the thing about 66 is there were a lot of good pieces to it, but it was probably too big for Colorado to swallow all at once. And certainly that's the way it proved out. But part of what was in there was full-day kindergarten for everybody,
Right.
and I think half-day preschool for anybody who wanted it. And that's a huge difference, makes a huge impact to get any kid, but certainly the at-risk kids, which Denver has, a large proportion of, to get them that early influence. It makes an incredible difference. And that's what I liked about 66 was it was, pieces of it were trying to focus on the things that would make the biggest difference to some of the most vulnerable kids. But it's, it was all wrapped up in a huge thing that was just too much for people to swallow. Part of it is taking that in pieces. Part of it is trying to find ways to do things without asking Colorado to approve an income tax hike. And of course that gets back to Tabor, and I would love to see Tabor untangled and to be able, that's another issue where this question of, we are a republic, and we're in theory supposed to elect people to represent us and make decisions for us. We're not supposed to, as a population, vote on every bill, but we do vote on the taxes, and that has certainly gotten in the way of some good things for Colorado, and I think some good things on the education front there. But I do think there's a lot. I think we're going to have to take that piece by piece. You're probably focusing on K through 12 education, but I was happy to see the first bill introduced at the Senate a couple days ago was on higher education and investing money back into higher education and putting a cap on how much schools can raise their tuition, because the debt that people are going through to get through college is enormous. And there's also a great idea. I don't think anybody asked about higher education, so I have a great idea on higher education that comes from elsewhere, but I won't.
Yeah, let's hear it.
I'm actually a college professor,
okay.
so that's all right.
Well, you may have heard about it. I believe it's Washington, right? Or is it Washington or Oregon? I think it's Oregon. That is just starting this year. Basically, they're calling it Pay It Forward, and it was a Pay It Forward bill that anybody can go to state school, 2-year or 4-year, for tuition free. And what they do to make that work, they're just starting it now, so we'll see if it works. But the idea is that when you graduate and go into the workforce, you take a small percentage of your salary, it goes back to the school or into the school system. And it is a small enough piece that it looks fairly painless, and it's about double if you're at a 4-year college or a 2-year college, but it's a little piece out of every paycheck. It isn't anything like what you pay when you're paying student loans, and it's basically the sort of pay it forward, because you got to get that first group through to graduate without having paid tuition, but then they're paying for everybody behind them. And I believe this started at Yale, that Yale was doing something similar to that. I don't know the details. I'll have to look up what Yale is doing. But we'll have to watch how it works out there. But I think it's a great idea, and it's a creative way to address a big economic problem. What else have we got?
Well, I'd ask a question. If you're similar to the representation we've had over the last 4, 6, 8, 12 years, that's good.
Okay.
However, you vote on state issues, and there's some state issues that continue to change. It was only 6 months ago where northeastern Colorado was talking about secession.
Yeah.
And that's something that will come to your desk.
Yeah.
You're going to have to help heal that,
Yeah.
that strip of land, and other issues such as that. Denver's not similar to a lot of the rest of the state.
Right.
So how do you deal with those who represent those areas too, because they've got the R in front of behind their name?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's something we are seeing in some ways surprisingly, in some ways not surprisingly, but that's a priority for this legislature this year, is to focus on rural Colorado, and it's specifically in response to that. I don't think we would have seen that come up naturally without this outcry that came from rural Colorado. And you know, in a way, I liken it to, you know, some of the neighborhoods we have in wherever that map is, but some of these corners that are, you know, people sometimes tell me, well, you know, I guess you don't have to worry about diversity issues in HD2 because we're all so white bread here or something like that. Well, you know, some neighborhoods are like that, but there are a lot of neighborhoods in HD2 that aren't, and we're 20% minority. You know, there are other districts that are 50% minority and more. So we're not the most diverse district, but we have a lot of diversity throughout the district. We have economic diversity, we have racial diversity, ethnic diversity, and I think statewide it's a similar kind of perspective that you get different pockets, and there are very different issues in rural Colorado than there are in Denver along the Front Range. I've spent a chunk of my life living in rural Colorado. You know, I lived in Carbondale and Gunnison, spent a lot of time in Durango, and I think that's helped me get some affinity for that part of the state. I can't say I've spent as much time in Eastern Plains, but I certainly wasn't in favor of anything like secession, and I wasn't in favor of some of the suggestions about how to change the representation. I actually read Jimmy Carter's book within the past year, his book about his first campaign, which was, I think, 1964 in Georgia, and it happened right after, immediately after, I mean, he filed days after they finally won a court case that took away a system where parts of, you know, where basically rural Georgia got more weight for their votes than urban Georgia did. And it was a county vote system, and it's a little complicated to try and describe briefly, but they did try to weight the votes, and it was really an effort to suppress the urban environment, and to, you know, for that, you know, it was certainly racial was a big part of it, for the landed rural part of the country to suppress the growing urban minority vote, and that was a big issue for Carter, and as soon as it got passed, he went and ran and won his first election. It's not entirely relevant to this discussion, but only in that, you know, there were some suggestions about that I think were a little far off, and a little overboard, but at the same time, I think hearing those voices, I'm glad to see that the legislature does hear those voices and is responding in the way that I would want to, of you know, putting some focus and taking some priorities on places that are a little harder to see and a little harder to hear what the issues are there.
I was really disgusted by the recall of those two senators, and just what can be done about the outside money that comes in to, and there's a lot of outside money that's coming in to, you know, just to take people down, just for one vote.
Right.
It's, what do you do about that?
Well, let me back up quickly and introduce Annabeth, who's precinct committee person here, and
Nancy does all the work.
lives a doorway, but no, just to show where people are, and who else, was that the last, was there a question? Oh, and Bob, who lives just down the block, lives in this neighborhood, and Greg here is from like West Washington Park, and Greg and I worked together trying to defend John Morse from the recall effort. I mean, there's a couple questions there, I think, maybe, but are you talking about the recalls themselves, or the influence of the money, or both?
The influence of the money that's coming in from out of state.
Yeah, I mean that's part, you know, and that the recall is one of those wide open things that doesn't have the inadequate, it doesn't have even the inadequate campaign finance regulations that we have on traditional campaigns. So you know, they were able to you know, take advantage of the super PACs and all this money that didn't need to be identified from outside sources. And came in, and I'm sure it played a huge role in the recalls, they're such strange beasts, and we're still trying to figure out how to handle those. I think to try to analyze the impact of the money down there, because there was equal money on both sides, probably. So I think they had a good fight. I think the people down there, part of what happened was people down there were just drowned by those voices, by the TV ads and the commercials. And what you had was the people who were angry, Second Amendment activists who felt their guns were being taken away, they were riled up by all that activity and all the commercials. And the people who didn't feel that strongly about that, or felt strongly that this recall should not be happening and wasn't justified, got frustrated by all that noise and all that, the noise that the money was making. And so you had the angry people active and going out and voting, and the frustrated people did sit home. We also had I think a slightly unethical county clerk down there, and slightly unethical and completely inept, who was running for Secretary of State, and points out that county clerk and Secretary of State are places where we need strong protectors of our rights in those offices. That's going to be an important race this year for Secretary of State. But they suppressed the vote in terms of suppressing mail ballot, and all those frustrated people who couldn't go to a voting place because they suppressed, they'd had as few voting locations as legally allowed, and they had 75% of them, which is to say 3 out of 4, outside of the district. So people, they couldn't go to their regular place to vote. They had to go find someplace outside of the district. People who lived outside of the district, who saw a voting location in their neighborhood that they always vote at, went there and voted and weren't allowed to vote because the voting place is not in the district and they don't live in the district and they're not allowed to vote, and it just caused all kinds of frustration. One issue that's not exactly at all what you're asking about, but I do feel like Denver legislators and Denver leaders, need to, this is a place where we need to be very bold and where we need to defend those others who are, aligned with us in other parts of the state where they can't be as bold and where they're much more vulnerable. I mean, they're not picking on anybody in Denver for a recall. And it doesn't necessarily help. Denver is something of an outside interest coming down there. But I do feel, I felt like that's something that we as a district, and I think I've played a part in encouraging us to help vulnerable districts like Dan Kagan's new district in District 3, where he went from a 12-point edge in our district to a 50-50 race in Arapahoe County. And we did a great job of getting District 2 out to the races that mattered and getting them out there to help give the push and mobilize people and set an example and get people out. And I tried to do that on the recalls. And, I know a few of us in the room here went down and helped out down there, and stayed up here and made phone calls down there. And I think that's something you've got to do, and that's one of those places where I hope you've seen me put my money where my mouth is when I'm not in office, and whether I'm running for office or not, and can rely on that being something that'll continue in office and won't be politics as normal, I hope.
Just on that issue, is there any way to change the recall law to limit it to malfeasance or illegal activity or that kind of thing?
I looked at that very carefully, and it's a problem because it's in the Constitution, specifically stating that there can be no standard. There is no standard for ethical or illegal activity. If somebody wants a recall, they have the right to have a recall, and it's up to the voters to decide whether it's valid or not. And it cannot go to the courts to say this doesn't meet a criteria.
Can you change the number of votes required to get it on the ballot?
You can, yeah, I mean, you can change the Constitution with the constitutional amendment.
Is that in the Constitution?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
Is it, what is it, 10%?
Oh, the number? It is, I think it's 25% of the last, those who voted in the last election.
Yeah.
So 11% of the population voted out John Morse by 343 votes. Over a policy issue that should be settled in an election, not in a recall. But I would love to see that changed in the Constitution. I couldn't wait to look it up and find out specifically what it says and what leverage do we have, and it's very specific that there is no, you can't challenge it. But I think when you say it's up to the voters to decide whether this is a valid recall, when you put it on the ballot and spend $250,000 to hold an election, I think voters take it for granted that this is a valid election. And so they're not out there deciding if it's valid or not, they're deciding how they want to vote on this valid election. It's got the stamp of validity by having the government hold the election and put it on the ballot and go through the entire process. So I'd like to see that change.
Speaking of Secretary of State, Owen, now that Ken Gordon is no longer with us, who are the other candidates at this point?
Well, it's Joe Neguse, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, does anybody know offhand? Who is currently a CU regent, and I don't know very much about him. He's the Democrat running for it, and one of the Republicans running is this county clerk from Colorado Springs. I think there's 2 or 3 running from on the Republican side. And we've had a hard time with statewide offices. It's been a long time since we've had, we being Democrats. I know not everybody here is a Democrat, and I appreciate that people from other affiliations support this campaign. But it has been hard to get other than a Republican in statewide office, other than governor and senator.
Well, Kerry Kennedy.
That's she was the last one in, and I think she's fantastic. I hope she's got a bright future still. I think she could be a good statewide candidate. I'd love to see her as governor someday, but we're getting ahead of ourselves now. But that's going to be one of the most important races, I think, to fight. Of course, governor and